Hello there, friends. I'm Mark Thomas, the minister of Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Blackwood. Thanks so much for joining me. We are continuing our series of Bible studies in the book of Nehemiah. So if you've got a Bible with you and you'd like to turn to Nehemiah in the Old Testament, find chapter 5, and we're going to just spend a few minutes this time reflecting on a couple of things. Thanks so much for joining me. So the book of Nehemiah here in the Bible, a fascinating story. And we've been doing a whole series of live Zoom Bible studies on a Wednesday evening. But this is not that. This is something different. This is just a few minutes where we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about something in chapter 5. So chapter 5 is chronologically something of an interlude from the work of building the walls that has dominated the narrative from chapter 3 onwards. And as this is a bit of an interlude to our live online studies, this is just a short video inviting you to read Nehemiah chapter 5 for yourself and consider some of the points found within it. So, after all the thrill and excitement of hearing about how pretty much everybody was mucking in and doing their bit in rebuilding the city walls, chapters 4 and 5 of Nehemiah there is an increase in the other feature that is present right from the outset, and that is opposition. It's been rumbling in the background as we've gradually been introduced to its named characters bit by bit, such that by the time you get to chapter 4, we get the fullest picture so far of the opposition that Nehemiah and his fellow Jerusalemites had faced. Chapter 4 could be said to be illustrative of the threat from outside. So there were the people of Samaria under the leadership of Sanballat in the north, and then in the east we had Tobiah the Ammonite, and then in the south Geshem the Arab. And all these are mentioned way back in chapter 2, gradually in chapter 3, and also then most predominantly in chapter 4. And in chapter 4, we're introduced to a fourth opponent, which in a sense confirms the fact that the whole city was surrounded north, south, east, and west with the Ashdodites. So chapter 4, a threat from without. But then chapter 5, the one that I want to encourage you to go and read now, is, well, arguably the threat from within. And it's a chapter that has three ways of dividing itself up. Verses 1 to 5, you see the complaints that Nehemiah heard. In verses 6 to 13, you see the steps that Nehemiah took. And then in verses 14 to 19, you see the example that Nehemiah set. We'll come back to those in a moment. So consider for a few moments verses 1 to 5 and the complaints that Nehemiah heard. Well, just a complaint, an outcry, really, a sense of injustice, a plea for justice can be heard in these verses. The sequence of events suggests that the economic difficulties that affected people in Judah related to the wall building program. The first group of protesters that you read about seems likely to be the people of Jerusalem, the Jerusalemites, who need to be able to feed their families, but are prevented from doing so because they're working on the wall. Its workforce had included people such as perfumers, goldsmiths, and merchants, and so they can't earn the money that they would normally earn to buy grain and bake bread, which was staple for them. They're the first people whose outcry this chapter refers to. And that very word is it conveys the sense of grief. It's the word for the cry of Abel's blood, which utters from the ground when his brother has killed him. And the word used to describe the Israelites' cry when they were oppressed in Egypt. This is the way the Jerusalemites are treating one another. The second group of people you discover in these verses comprises people who still own their land, perhaps in the immediate environment of Jerusalem, or perhaps in one of the areas further away that the list of workers mentions, such as Tekoa and Gibeon. They would have had to abandon their work on the farm to work on the wall. They bring in an extra consideration that they have in fact been poor harvests and therefore famine. Famine was a natural disaster, though there is enough mention of poor that it was an experience that happened to them time and time again. But the people's point here is that they had to abandon their work on the farm in order to assist with the work in the city. The third group of people mentioned in this section points to a different type of burden. Globalization is a burden on ordinary people, but being part of the Persian Empire, as they were, brought benefits, though they can't see those benefits for themselves because they were under obligation to pay imperial taxes. And this obligation put a pressure on their own livelihoods. So once again, if they are living a subsistence level and can only just produce enough food for themselves, having to surrender perhaps 20% to the imperial coffers to keep the emperor and his staff in a style of life to which they're accustomed, perhaps push them over the edge and into debt. So their lament then is not that they have to lease their farms to another family, but they have to sell the labor of members of their family to other families. Of course, in Western culture, we take for granted the sale of our labor. Work means employment for someone. But the Old Testament ideal is that people work for themselves in the context of a family. It's weird to sell your labor, the Old Testament thinks, even for a few years to pay off the family's debt, because it breaks up family. So this big project of rebuilding the walls around the city, it affected the whole economy, the entire country. To put it theologically, it requires sacrifice on the part of the community. Yet it can happen that while some people are prepared to make the sacrifice for God's sake and the community's sake, other people are rather inclined to see the project as a means of making a profit for themselves rather than making a sacrifice. That's something to think through. So if verses 1 to 5 show that the complaints that Nehemiah heard, verses 6 to 13 show the steps Nehemiah took. Well, Nehemiah gets steamed up at what he hears. He's regularly a guy whose emotions seem to run high and who shows how that he can be fruitful, how this can be fruitful in generating action. He is a man of passion. And there is something wrong if you don't feel passionate about the injustices that other people experience. So Nehemiah responds, and like Saul, Nehemiah is an example of the way anger can be a fruit of the Spirit, a capacity that God uses in order to get the right things done. Admittedly, it's also worth noting that on this particular occasion, he thinks before he speaks. He lets his thinking offer him advice, to take up this slightly strange but suggestive formulation. After he hears the protests and has felt the anger rising within him, you can almost hear him saying, "Stay cool, Nehemiah, stay cool. Think this through before you open your mouth." And then he confronts them and calls a community meeting. It is, after all, a community issue. In this section, we discover that there were a group of people who were using the economic challenges, the economic pressures that some were experiencing, to become wealthy themselves, to get better off, if you like. They're described as the heads and the overseers. And these two groups, in some measure, overlap. The former, the heads, well, that compromises the heads of families who are using the situation to make their families better off at the expense of other families by means of the conditions that they attach to the loans that they're making. The latter group, the overseers, well, that comprises people who have some sort of administrative responsibility in the city. They were therefore in a position to do the same thing by way of the laws that they're passing. As we know in our world, the haves and the people with power are always in a position to take advantage of their status in relation to the have-nots, the powerless. So the gap between rich and poor seems to just increase time and time again. This is something to consider carefully in our day as we see it here in this passage. So let's move to the third section. If the first section in this chapter is verses 1 to 5, the complaints that Nehemiah heard, and then you see in verses 6 to 13, the steps Nehemiah took. Now you see in verses 14 to 19, and I would encourage you to read these, the example that Nehemiah sets. Nehemiah needs to be in a position to show that he is not using his authority to benefit himself. He was very likely reasonably well off and a person with authority. And he and his associates are lending people grain and silver, effectively money, and he is not charging interest. Other people need to do the same. Or perhaps he implies that he and his associates are charging interest, though presumably not with the same poor, unfortunate results described by those who are protesting. The diner's presence here at Nehemiah's table models how the community's pulling together can make it possible to meet the great sacrifice involved in rebuilding. The community's adversaries then have less vulnerability to work with. So let me finally encourage you to read this chapter again and note these headings: the complaints that Nehemiah heard, the steps that Nehemiah took, and the example that Nehemiah set. And if you also have time, perhaps you'd like to read Leviticus chapter 25. Turn back in your Bible a few pages to the book of Leviticus, because Leviticus chapter 25 also makes the same type of point that Nehemiah is demonstrating in his life. The way people deal with poverty of their neighbors is an aspect of how they live in relation to God. You see, you can't separate your economic policy from the way God expects people to treat each other. That's always been the case, and it still is today. And it's a challenge, isn't it? Our economic practice and our economic policy and the way we relate to God, they are combined. So bless you as you read this passage on your own, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye.